Hello, my name is Stephanie de Roemer and I work as a conservator for object for the University of Cambridge Museums. And today I'm answering questions for Ask A Conservator Day from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Well, I became a conservator. I was very interested in history and object storytelling, working with my hands. So I did find out about the profession of becoming a restorer conservator, and that involved me enrolling at a university course to study conservation and restoration of surface decorations, which brought me to the UK. And after that, I did a master's degree in conservation of historic objects, which is really objects for archaeology and anthropology. Now, depending on what you might be interested in, there's obviously paintings conservation, there's textiles conservation, there's conservation of working objects. So there are quite a lot of different conservation specialisms to get into. In some ways, it's not that different at all. It's very similar, but I think the biggest difference probably is that we conservators, we really work on the object and with the object, and more in a technical and practical sense than maybe an archivist or curator generally does. Saying this, some curators, and I think especially archivists, will be handling objects obviously as well, but the conservator goes a step further, where it's really it's a bit like a doctor for objects, maybe, if that makes sense. So we would go ahead and intervene with the object, and that can be anything from cleaning it to maybe mending it or repairing parts, reconstructing parts. But we also do a lot of research, especially into materials, and primarily to understand maybe even what was how did the object get damaged in the first place? What were the factors or the agents involved that led to the object looking like it does today? So there's a little bit of forensic science in there. And again, I think this is what I mentioned before, the aspect of storytelling in a way, really discovering what happened to an object. So that's also conservation. And I think very often we do work with curators, we work with all sorts of people together, and this is maybe the next step. Some of these questions address this, where the conservator doesn't really make the decisions on his or her own. It's always in collaboration with the other stakeholders, as we call them, in a museum environment. That would be the curator most of the time, but it can be also a local community, a source community, often here in MAA, to do with the anthropological collections. But it can be also a private owner of an artwork. So it is not my decision what should happen or shouldn't happen to an object. It's always in conversation with the stakeholder, i.e. the owner of the artifact or object or the cultural heritage asset, however you want to describe that. And it's through conversations really establishing the value, what matters. And in conservation then we do have principles and practices similar to, again, I think the medical profession, which has codes of ethics, where we also have guidelines such as minimum intervention. So we want to curb our DIY enthusiasm, so to speak, but also reversibility, which is an important thing. If I add something to an object, I have to record it, so it's really clear somewhere that I added this. It's not authentic to the object, but also it should be reversible. And this is something that comes from experience when, for example, new materials have been used and they caused more damage in the long term than they did good to an object, and they can be really impossible to reverse. So there are these sort of guidelines. And again, I kind of veered off a bit, but it's really, there are lots of similar things we do as the curator does and the archivist, but really we're kind of just doing a lot of supporting and working with others. I think it's the unexpected, it's the diversity of specifically objects. As an object conservator, that means anything and everything. I have worked on objects from ancient civilizations and objects or artworks, contemporary artworks that don't even have a material, so things like performance art. And I think that to me really is the most interesting thing. You never stop learning. So it doesn't matter how old something is or where it comes from, it's always just really super interesting, exciting. I think what they all have in common is just really the ingenuity of humans, the kind of great skills and reoccurring themes even. So that's what I find interesting. So there is not just one thing. The other thing is, again, it's humans overall. So initially, when I became a conservator for objects, I would sometimes jokingly say how they can't talk back. I'm not working with people, but actually it's all about people. And again, that's something that is also super interesting. If that's really in some ways getting in touch with people from the past through an object, through the work, and retracing the steps of the maker or maybe the collector, that can be very powerful with some objects, but also with my colleagues nowadays, and especially colleagues who maybe are not conservators, hearing different ideas or perceptions of the same object. So all of this is really interesting. So it is the diversity of just people, skills, and all the different things. Now, there's a couple of things in here. There's never a standard treatment for anything, even for the same material. But what I think the standard is in conservation is what we call a condition assessment. And so every object that comes my way, I basically will have a good look at it. And that's really to establish, it's a sort of description of the object, what it is made of, what is its appearance. I would probably take measurements. So some, again, maybe if you think of going to the doctor, they take the vital stats. In a way, that's what I do about an object. So it starts really with maybe a technical brief description, if it has an object number, who's the owner, all that sort of thing. And doing that, I start to look closer and closer at the object. And this is then where the training comes in, where I basically start to see any marks that could potentially be damage or alterations. And so I start to record all of this. And this very quickly then gives me an idea, for example, if the object is structurally stable, if there is any chemical processes like with metal objects, there might be corrosion. So immediately I start to kind of think towards certain paths to do with specific materials. And again, with, for example, corroding metals, I know at one point there was a high level of humidity involved. So when it comes to mold, as it says here, very often it is visible. And it's not only visible, the first thing with collections that have mold or with objects that have molds actually smell. So this is one of the senses we might not think necessarily about, but conservators, we do use smell if we don't have a cold. And you have to be careful with that, obviously. But so there might be an initial kind of smell of mold or damp, which might already alert me to start looking out for mold. Mold can present in lots of different ways. So again, there is it's not always obvious. The more mold, different types of mold you see, the better you become in identifying it. But Google image search is great. So you could literally just type in mold of textiles or how to identify mold. There are lots of different ways in doing that. But I think most of the time you might be, with the smell and seeing these spots, you might be fairly confident, yes, this is mold. So any moldy textile, or which is specific here to the question, get it into a lighter space, and air movement is very important. So to get some air movement, mold basically grows in dark, damp and stagnant, air stagnant environments. It's similar with condensation in the morning, opening the window a little bit, letting some fresh air in. That can be a really good, simple preventive way of stopping build-up of condensation and then the growth of mold. In terms of how to deal with it on fabrics, that can become complicated, and I would recommend to maybe look to find a textile conservator specifically, or a conservator, because it depends on the textile. So there can be, for example, there are solvents and ways to remove mold from surfaces of objects, but you have to understand what your object is made of. So textiles can have dyes that are water soluble or soluble in certain solvents. So you wouldn't only remove the mold, you would also remove that color, maybe if it's a dyed textile. So it becomes a bit more complex. But a good way, maybe what can be done, as I say, is to move the textile that has mold out of a dark, damp space into some light, not too bright, but basically where it's a bit drier, it's a bit warmer. And once it's dry, you could attempt with a soft brush and a vacuum cleaner to brush off the mold. But then keep it, don't put it back into a dark, damp environment, because the mold spores can sit quite deep and probably come back. Oh, that's also really difficult because it's for different reasons. So some conservation work was really the object itself that was very, very special and wonderful. Some conservation projects I enjoyed were maybe at the beginning really challenging, and kind of problem solving that through the whole process, and really afterwards seeing the benefit to the object by making it accessible. I think it's most satisfying really getting an object that was not possible to be shown at all because of its condition, to get that out on display or to make it accessible for people to see. That's what I think find is the most memorable kind of conservation work, that care to really bring something back. But as I said, there are lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's also just the people I have been working with maybe that make something really memorable. So it really depends. It's very difficult to say. Very good question is to not maybe bring food into a museum, and I know that this can be difficult. So my tip would be, the simplest thing really is to keep food in a bag. Don't bring it into the galleries, and yes, consume food in the cafe or in the designated areas. That's one very, I think, basic, simple thing. I know as a mum myself, it can be also difficult sometimes with children, but that would be my tip to probably reduce or to help prevent pests from entering the museum and living there. In a way, they all have their challenges, but the training of a conservator, you learn exactly how to deal with these challenges. So as a material, I don't know if it qualifies, the most difficult material I find is light. And that's something that's obviously very ephemeral. You might even argue it's not a material. But again, throughout humanity's kind of culture in creating artworks and things, light actually is a material artists would have used. And specifically when it comes to sculpture and architecture, there are a lot of artworks, I've seen it in contemporary art, where light really is a medium, and a medium in terms of being a material that is part that makes the artwork perform. And I'm very convinced that in antiquity, in ancient times, that would have been exactly the same. But obviously, and this is why I'm saying it's the most difficult material to work with, because it's very difficult to reconstruct or to even understand how something might have been lit. But we do know decorative surfaces, even something like medieval polychrome wood sculpture, for example, has surfaces that are gilded or have certain materials on them where we know it was all part of the interaction between those sparkling reflective surfaces and the light, and that then goes into aspects of transcendence and what it does to the viewer or the person who looks at that artwork. So I know it's maybe not specifically a material, but I think that would be the most difficult material to work with. Yes, quite a lot. It's really to do with the Stormove project here for the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. There is a really fantastic team of lots of wonderful people who all come from different angles really, but all work towards the same goal, which is really packing up a collection and handling objects to move them from one place to the next. And as also a wonderful conservation colleague, and I do learn there all the time. And again, it goes back to maybe at the beginning of what I said, what I find so interesting about my work as a conservator is you never stop learning, and that comes through working with people. So at the moment through that project, I really learn, I feel I learn every day something new. The short answer is no. there are no shortcuts, because a lot of conservation is really doing it's being very cautious. It's really being very cautious about an object. And again, what I mentioned earlier, sometimes the best intention can actually quite damaging to an object. Cleaning things, it really needs a lot of understanding of what is it you want to clean, why do you want to clean something, and then how to clean it. And that really goes into understanding what is the object, what does it consist of. So it might be a wood carving, it might have traces of pigments, of paint media, and so not really knowing why exactly, what it is, how it works, can be quite tricky. And I think we all might know of some examples of amateur conservation gone wrong. I think the most prominent example is the Eco Homo painting in Spain in a church. And again, it was a well-meaning individual who really cared for that, which is quite tragic. But it is an example to show how unfortunately horrible it can become. So there are no short courses in quickly learning how to do that, but it can be a fun thing to look into maybe different materials and do one's own research, and maybe even get a conservator to discuss things for a whole collection, what can be done. It's not possible to restore. Pigments are really vulnerable to light mainly, so they can change color or they basically fade. So once the light damage happens, once the pigment fades or the color fades, it's not possible to bring it back. So it's not really possible to restore the pigment, and I would say the first thing to do is maybe to move it from, if it stands by a window or it's specifically daylight, that will be the most damaging in terms of making the pigments fade. So moving it into a darker area where it isn't exposed to light, to extreme light all the time, is one way to basically slow down the process of light fading, as we call it. In terms of replacing the red, yes, of course that is possible, but that becomes more tricky in terms of thinking about, I guess, authenticity, and also repainting. Effectively, you would have to repaint it, really. That's the point I'm trying to make. So before that would happen, it would be important to understand, what pigment is it? And also what was the binding medium. So every paint is basically, it's pigment with a binder, as we call it. That might be water-based, it might be oil-based, acrylics, all of these, but it's always pigment in a binding material. And so that would be important to understand what was the paint really that's been used. That would be the first step. If this would be something I would come across here, I would want to understand what was a pigment and what was binding material. And then there are just a lot of other questions really to be answered around it. What are the expectations of that restoration treatment? Should it look brand new? Is that acceptable? Is that with keeping with maybe how these objects would be cared for in general? So there are lots more questions, and again, maybe just investigating those questions could be also quite interesting and even fun. And this is often what I enjoy about conservation, is really finding out or going on a journey to try and answer those questions. And that's where a lot of learning is happening, and then really also an engagement with maybe that culture, the practices, why were they made, what for, were they made. And so afterwards, maybe the color fading is not that significant anymore.